Thank you. So just to mention real quick, there's some cards on the table in the back by the sound booth, which has more information about where you can find me online. I do a little YouTube show and some other things that I do, so I'd love to connect with you there. But I'm so happy to be here today. I've been Foursquare all my life, and there's something about coming to a Foursquare church that always feels like coming home. And you guys are just awesome. I can tell this is a place where you are happy to be, like where you love each other, you love the Lord, you feel the Lord here for sure. And so I was so blessed by the prayers of your team before service. I hope that I can be a blessing to you. And we've been talking about joy, and the thing is that joy can sometimes feel really hard to come by, right? We want joy, we know that God has joy for us, but especially when we're facing unexpected times and things that we don't understand, that feeling of joy can be really hard to grasp. And when I was thinking about this and just thinking about another time when there was a young couple who was facing some unexpected things, some things they didn't fully understand, and that was Mary and Joseph. And we hear the story of Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus, and most people have heard it their whole lives. Even if you didn't grow up in church, you probably heard about this baby Jesus thing at Christmas. But the familiarity of the story can make the power of the story be missing sometimes. And so I began to think, how can we make this story real? What would it be like if Jesus was born here today? How would God show up in our world? And how would Mary and Joseph face the unexpected things that they faced? And so I wrote a story, because sometimes sermons can be so powerful, but sometimes it's a story that we need to break through and bring truth. And so this is a true story I'm sharing with a different time and a different place. So let's enter in today and see if we can find a little bit of joy through this. Mary shifted uncomfortably in her seat on the bus, trying to find a way to stretch out and ease the tension in her lower back, move those swollen ankles, stretch the neck muscles that were sore from sleeping against the Greyhound bus window. They were 15 hours into a 28-hour trip north from San Bernardino, California to Albany, Oregon. Joseph noticed her roused from her nap, and he put away the battered paperback he was holding, gave his full attention to his new wife. "Hey, babe, how are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Oh, I suppose I'm as well as can be expected," she yawned. "I'm warm, the sun is shining, I'm with the man I love. What more could I want?" Joseph couldn't quite suppress his grunt of displeasure. Said quietly, "I can think of a few things," as he stared into his lap. Mary gently took his hand in hers and said, "Joseph, will you look at me? I know this isn't the way we would have chosen our life to go, but I believe God is in this moment. I'm so happy to be here with you, and I'm so happy to be part of his plan. We don't know what will happen, but we're in this together." And we'd always talked about going back to Albany, where you're from, right? So this is a good opportunity. You know, this census nonsense that made us come up here, this is God at work. We're going to be all right. "Oh, Mary," Joseph responded, now putting an arm around his wife and holding her other hand tightly. "What did I do to deserve such an amazing, beautiful wife?" Now it was Mary's turn to grunt in protest. "Beautiful? I hardly feel beautiful. Not many men would marry a woman who looks like me. But you have such beautiful eyes and lustrous skin and lovely hair. Oh, blah, blah, blah. You know I'm not talking about that. It's this big belly. I just feel like a polar bear, and I walk like a penguin, and Oh, he just kicked. Oh, see, even little man doesn't want you to talk about yourself that way. So Joseph put his hand on her belly where they could feel and really see a foot or something moving across the belly through the thin sweater that Mary wore. And they giggled together and settled back in their seats. After a moment, she said, "Joseph, I really don't know what I would do without you. There really aren't a lot of men who would stay with their intended when it became clear she was carrying a child that wasn't his. I'm so happy to be with you on a bus or wherever we are. I know God will take care of us. He'll show us the way." "He always does," Joseph agreed. Joseph, I need to get out and use the bathroom." "Again? You just went an hour ago." "Oh, I know, the baby." Mary got out of her squeeze out of the bus seat and walked down the narrow aisle to the tiny little bus on the back of the Greyhound. And as Joseph watched her go, he thought about all the strange things that had happened over the last couple of years. Mary had a summer job at the diner near where he was doing his apprenticeship in the carpentry union. He was building cabinetry and other woodwork and usually would bring a lunch, but he'd forgotten one day, so he went to the diner nearby. And as Mary came to take his order, all I could think about was her sparkling eyes visible over the mask that all the restaurant workers wore these days. He ended up saying, "Just bring me the special," which was broccoli soup. Ugh. But he came back nearly every day to see that girl. He had a feeling that he'd only had one other time in his life. There was a man who had led him to the carpentry union, and when he met that man, he thought, this person's going to be important in my life. And now he felt that about Mary. This person was going to be important in his life. And yet, he quickly realized it wasn't about a job. It was about so much more. He came back and, well, he fought his feelings at first because she was so young, as he found out when her dad noticed his interest and warned him away. See, he owned the diner, but Mary was still in high school. But when she turned 18 a few months later, he asked her dad if he could ask her out and take her to dinner. And Dad had asked around to see if there could find anything bad about this Joseph fellow, but he couldn't, and so he gave permission. After that, it was only a few months before they were engaged and ready to get married when she finished high school. But then there was an uptick in the coronavirus pandemic. The diner had to close. Mary's school had to close down again. And she was just out of all of these things that she looked forward to. No senior prom, no high school graduation parties. All of these things just came to a stop. And yet she didn't have too much time to think about it, because just a week into that next quarantine they faced, Mary had a vision in the night. An angel appeared to her and told her that she would have a baby, and it would be God's baby, and she should call him Jesus. Well, this was rather confusing because Mary and Joseph were waiting for marriage before they became intimate. And immaculate conception, didn't that just happen like in Star Wars? But she believed God, and she embraced the promise and the opportunity he was giving her. It had been a little harder for Joseph to embrace. Mary took off to visit her relatives in Vegas, you see. They worked on a Native American reservation outside of town. It was Aunt Elizabeth and Uncle Zechariah, and turns out Aunt Elizabeth was also pregnant, even though she seemed well past that time in her life. But Zechariah also had some kind of illness where he couldn't speak at all, and so they could really use the help. So since she was finishing school online, she went out and stayed with them out in the desert area. And after a few months, it became clear that she really was pregnant. Joseph, they'd only spoken over the phone and video chats, but when he realized and he knew it wasn't his, He was furious. He couldn't understand. She'd go off to Vegas and get pregnant? What, was it the pressure? Was it just too much? Was she trying to find a way to get out of it? But he still loved her. So he decided to just quietly call it all off. And then he also had a vision at night. An angel came to him and said, Joseph Davidson, do not be afraid to go ahead with your marriage to Mary, for the child within her has been conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. It was crazy, but it was the most real thing he had ever experienced. And so he left that weekend, drove out to Vegas, and they got married. They were together a few months before the baby was due, and they decided they would just stay separate until the baby was born, because they wanted there to be no question that this was the Lord's baby. I mean, they were sure nobody would probably believe them in all of this, but for them it was important to do it the way that God said to do it. It was God's child. They couldn't really take a honeymoon anyway. And then, unexpectedly, construction dried up. And even more unexpectedly, due to some kind of issue with the 2020 census, anybody wanting government aid or unemployment now had to go back to their hometown where they were from. It was ridiculous, but here they were on their way to Albany, where Joseph was from, and the Davidsons had lived for years. And so here they were, poor as temple mice, essentially homeless, pregnant, and without a plan. He just hoped his relatives would let them stay, but until they could get the government assistance worked out. But he hadn't been able to get a hold of them. Mary waddled back down the narrow bus aisle to where he was, and she settled into the seat again, looking out the window and making small talk. Pretty soon, Joseph dropped off to sleep. Mary kept looking out the window at that beautiful scenery outside. Mountains and trees, so different from the desert area where she'd grown up in Southern California. Her thoughts these days were nearly always on the baby. Her parents and others warned her she probably shouldn't travel this close to her due date, but they had to get up before the end of the year, so they decided to travel without a baby instead of with one. And so they came to Albany. And even though it was now night, she could clearly see outside the moon and the light of the amazing star that was in the sky. The star that she'd noticed for several months. What was it? Planetary alignment? Supernova? Mary didn't pay attention to these things. To her, that star seemed like God's guiding light, a promise that things would be good. As sure as Noah's rainbow, it was a sign she could look into the sky, that God would care for her and for the son that was growing inside of her. The amazing miracle come down. She fell asleep again peacefully, content to know that God would work things out. Finally, just as dawn was edging its way forward, they rolled into the town of Eugene to a sky of light gray and pink. Here they would change buses for the final hour of the trip into Albany, and they saw a tall building nearby, the tallest, lit up with a sign on top. Peace on earth, it said. What a wonderful thought. Mary took it as another good sign. They had 20 minutes or so to stretch out before getting on a different bus for the final leg, and the time flew by. Soon they were seated on their way up to Albany. As they rode north, they watched the sunrise over the hills to the east, and they saw the landscape change from gray to many shades of green. The Mid-Willamette Valley was full of farms, flocks of sheep, so entirely different from the warm desert area where she was from. There was a saying, "Can anything good come out of San Bernardino?" But Joseph always said the best things must come from San Bernardino, since that's where Mary was from. She knew it was biased and an exaggeration, but it always made her smile. When they finally came to a stop in Albany, Mary took a deep breath of the clean, cold air. It felt like breathing in hope. Hey, anything felt good after being on the bus for so long. Joseph grabbed their couple of bags, and she managed a little backpack and her belly, and they decided to walk a while and see if they could find a place to eat breakfast. They found a cafe that was kind enough to let them charge a cell phone and use the bathroom, of course. And breakfast was when the first contractions started. Mary tried to stay calm. It's probably just a false alarm. Nothing to worry about. She didn't want to mention it to Joseph because he had so much on his mind trying to figure out where they would stay and take care of everything. He still couldn't get a hold of his relatives. Mary suggested they just head to their house since they didn't have a plan anyway. Maybe they'd catch someone at home. Joseph seemed uncertain, but since they didn't have another plan, it seemed that was the best place to start. So they looked up a bus schedule again and found a route that would take them to within a couple of blocks of the house, and so soon they were on their way. The contractions kept coming, but they were light and irregular, so Mary kept going. On the way, Joseph said, "One thing you ought to know about my aunt." "Oh, what's that?" "Well, she's Jewish." "Joseph, we're Jewish." "Well, she's really Jewish." Mary just rolled her eyes and shrugged, and they came to the house, and there were cars in the driveway, so that's good. They walked up and fixed their masks in place, not knowing how the relatives would feel about that sort of thing. And so they knocked on the door after taking a deep breath. The door didn't open, but they heard a voice call from inside, "Just leave the package on the step." Joseph called. "It's not a package. It's Joseph. Joseph Davidson. I left you some messages." The door cracked open just a bit. "Joseph?" the woman asked. "Joseph, I can't believe you actually came up here. Oh, you look more like your father Jacob every day." She glanced at Mary. "I suppose this must be your wife. I saw on Facebook that you got married. I didn't expect to travel down there with the pandemic and all, but it would have been nice to receive an invitation." "Well, we didn't really have a formal wedding," he said. "Oh, shotgun wedding, eh? Oh, I can see why Dad would want to make sure you did right by the girl. You got married, what, 3 months ago? And she is 8 months along, maybe? Not the way I would do things." She grunted, not looking very charitable or welcoming. "Well, it isn't exactly like that," Joseph started. "Oh, yes, you young people always want to make up your own reasons for you to do whatever you want to do. Well, what are your plans now that you're in town?" "Well, I was hoping you could help us, Joseph said. "See, we don't have a place to stay, and Mary is due soon, so we were hoping we could stay here while I look for work." At her incredulous look, Joseph added, "See, I just lost my job, and because of the census and everything, we didn't really have a choice but to come up here, and my car died, and so we took the bus, and..." "Oy vey ist mir," she said. "You expect me to just take you in from San Bernardino in the middle of a pandemic, and you haven't quarantined for 2 weeks? What do you expect from me? And a baby. I don't have anything for a baby. You have some chutzpah, Joseph Davidson. Your lack of planning is not my emergency." "Oh," Mary cried out as she doubled over with a fresh contraction, not able to hide it this time. "Talk about emergency. Girl, how far along are you really? You look like you're going into labor now." And now Joseph looked truly alarmed. As the contraction resolved, Mary said, "It's nothing. I'm due soon, but I'm fine." The woman gave Mary a calculating look and turned back to Joseph and said, "Son, I can't take you to the hospital, see, and I can't take you in. I have my own health risks to worry about, and I can't take any chances. But you need to get that girl checked out, and you need to find some other place to stay. Here, hold on." She shut the door and went inside. Joseph looked at Mary and said, You're not having the baby right now, are you?" Oh, no, I'm sure it's fine. Pre-labor contractions are totally normal, they say. I probably have another week. Don't worry. Before he could ask more, the door opened once again. Here, she said, and thrust an envelope into his hand. There's a list of community resources and a little bit of money. Get a hotel or something. And here, she gave him a paper bag. There's some nosh, just a bit of what I have. Hold on. She disappeared again for a moment, and Joseph and Mary looked at each other in bewilderment, and she soon popped out again. Here, child. She turned to Mary, this time with the door a little bit more wide open and a little more softness in her voice. She handed a warm hat and gloves and a scarf to Mary. I picked these up the other day. They're a nice set, but, well, you need 'em more. It's not so cold in Southern California, is it? Well, she looked at Mary's bulging stomach again and gruffly continued, hoping to get them off her porch before she could feel guilty about sending them away. Well, off you go, mazel tov. As she closed the door, they could hear her mutter to herself, it's not my emergency. I don't know what they expect from me. Hardly spoken to him in years. Mary put on the warm, soft items she'd been handed. These are quite nice, she said. What a nice thing to give me. Poor dear, she must be so worried about this pandemic. And look, she gave us some sub sandwiches. They must have been delivered by that Uber Eats driver we saw come down the street. One of them smells like a meatball sub, Joe. That's your favorite. What a nice surprise. Really is a beautiful day. They say it rains here a lot, but it's not raining right now. Well, should we take a look at the list she gave us and figure out what to do? Joseph stared at her in wonder. I don't know how you manage to remain so positive all the time, Mary. He picked up their bags and they started off back towards the bus stop again. He was always amazed at her optimism and unfailing trust in God, even through all the uncertainties of the past months. I can't help it, Joseph. It's such a wonderful world God has made. I figure we can look at our limits or we can look at our opportunities. And besides, I'm so excited. There's so many new opportunities in front of us. The baby will be here soon. You know, I was reading the prophet Isaiah on the app on the phone on the way up here. And do you know what it said? Joseph shook his head, so she said, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased our joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Joseph, I think Isaiah was talking about our baby, our Jesus, our little Emmanuel. God will work everything out. Oh! Ooh. She had another contraction, and Joseph's almost calm face turned to panic again. Okay, we are going to the hospital, he said. Mary was starting to think that might be a good idea. Soon she was smiling again. All right, we'll go and get checked out. It was a slow walk to the bus stop, especially as Mary couldn't walk very quickly in her condition. The contractions kept coming, but they were irregular. Mary kept moving. The city was full of life. Strung over the main streets, there were signs announcing the Winter Solstice Festival. Many businesses had Go Beavers signs up in the window. There was a bowl game that they were in coming up, and they saw signs for watch parties all over town. After stopping to rest a few times and heading in the wrong direction a few other times, they found a park bench and sat down and ate their sub sandwiches, and it was afternoon by the time they reached the station for the bus to the hospital. So distracted was Joseph in his worry and Mary in dealing with the pains of oncoming labor that they didn't at first realize that though they had been at the right station, they'd gotten on the wrong bus. The bus was heading out of town instead of further into town toward the hospital, and they could see soon only farmland again. They asked the driver and found out this bus was continuing eastward out of town. And so when they pulled into a remote gas station, they figured they better get off the bus there and try to see how they could get back into town. Unfortunately, there were only a couple hours of daylight left, and one of those would be waiting for the next bus to come through. To kill time, they picked up a newspaper someone had left behind and were alarmed to see news of a recent uptick in coronavirus cases, that the hospital was overflowing, and several wings were not taking any new patients unless it was an emergency. They began to think maybe the hospital wasn't the best plan after all. As they discussed their dilemma of where they might stay for the night, a woman came over and addressed them. "Hey there, folks. I couldn't help but overhear your little dilemma. Out-of-towners and no place to stay, is that right? Well, can I offer you some free advice?" They silently nodded, and so the woman continued. "I don't know if you saw, but there's a whole heap of stuff going on in town right now. We got the Solstice Festival with events that go on every night until the new year. There's concerts and all sorts of things, and lots of folks have come to town for the watch parties for the Beavers Bowl game this weekend. And then there's all those who came because of the census mishap from last year. Seems like a lot coming to this area. And everybody's trying to get everything sorted out before the new year. Well, I'm from out of town myself, staying with my sister here. Why? Not because I like my sister, but because there's no other place to stay. I called all over town, but I did notice there's a bed and breakfast a couple miles down the road, and you might have more luck there than if you go out of town, back into town again. I could give you a lift if you want. It's only a couple miles down, and it's on my way." Joseph looked at Mary, who nodded silently, and so soon they were on their way again, not quite sure why it seemed like a good idea to get in a stranger's car and head further out of town. But they had peace about the decision anyway. They didn't talk, for the driver kept up a steady stream of conversation all on her own, and soon they came to a beautiful property with a nice row of hedges and an ironwork sign above that said Bethlehem Inn. They could see a barn with some horses grazing nearby, and then further down the drive there was a beautiful large farmhouse with a sign in front that read Bethlehem Inn Bed and Breakfast. The driver dropped them off, and as Mary got out of the car and stretched out again, she looked to the sky at the growing dusk. She could already see the moon, and they could see only that one amazing star, which seemed to be just about right overhead now. The driver left, and they went up a few steps to the porch, just behind another couple who had pulled in moments earlier. There was a small foyer in the entrance, and Mary looked about while a woman helped the other couple. She looked to be about Mary's mother's age. She noticed a framed painting on the wall with an inscription beneath. It was a painting of the house, and it said, "Bethlehem is the Hebrew word meaning house of bread. True to its name, we serve fresh bread with every breakfast from wheat grown and milled on this farm." Lechem sounds like the Hebrew phrase l'chaim, which means to life. May your life be blessed by our bread and hospitality. Suddenly, Mary felt a lump in her throat as she tried to hold back tears, overcome by the words on the inscription, by the tiredness of her body, and the weariness of travel. She suddenly knew two things. Her body did not want to go any further this night, but her soul knew on a deeper level that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The woman left to settle the first couple into a room, and as they headed for the stairs, she said, "I'll be with you in a moment." Soon after, a man came in wearing work clothes, but acting like he owned the place. Turns out he did. "Well, hello there, I'm Luke. Can I help you two settle in?" He took a cursory glance at Mary's belly, but acted as if it was completely normal to have 9 months-long pregnant women in his inn. "That would be wonderful," Mary said. "We would love to stay here. I feel at home already somehow." "Well, all righty then," laughed the man, going around to an iPad they had at a pedestal. "What's the name? And I'll see where my wife Lydia has you placed." I'm Joseph Davidson, and this is my wife Mary, but I'm afraid we don't have a reservation. Where we had planned to stay is not a possibility." Oh, no reservation? Oh, I'm afraid we're full up for the night, Luke said. You see, we got the OSU watch parties everywhere and the Solstice Festival, and a bunch of hotels are quarantining patients there near the hospital. In fact, we've been full all month. At this point, Mary felt another contraction come on. She sat down on a bench to see it through. Joseph asked if there was any way they could use Wi-Fi to search for other hotels in town or order an Uber. Well, Luke explained that somebody had come through an hour earlier wanting to do the same thing and couldn't find anything within an hour away. Mary was now recovered and asked softly, "Sir, is there anything you can do for us? We feel God has led us here, but we have many things that are unknown at the moment. We would appreciate any help that you can give." The man looked kindly at Mary and said, "I'm afraid the only bed we have open is a bunk out in the barn. I sleep out there while the mares are in full. We have a top-rate breeding program here. I delivered one last week, in fact. Or we hire on extra help at harvest, and they sleep out in the bunks." "It's perfect," Mary said quickly, to Joseph's astonishment. Luke also seemed surprised. "Really?" But he just shrugged and said, "Well, okay then, I guess I'll take you out there right now. We keep some linens and towels out there, so we'll have you all set in a jiffy." As he walked them out, he jabbered on about how they'd never rented out that room before, and what a good idea, and why didn't he think of that? And they'd be able to make some more money that way. And he said, "Heck, I'll even let you stay here for free for giving me the idea for all that future revenue." As they walked into the barn, Mary noticed a few rows of wooden feeding troughs to the side for the horses, set high on an X-shaped frame, good eating level for the horses. "Oh, look at that, Joseph. Those are beautiful. Do you think you could make something like that?" she asked. Well, Joseph, being a carpenter, noticed the craftsmanship as well and couldn't help but turn his worry and indignation over where they were staying into some companionship with this farmer, who, as it turned out, made and sold these mangers as a side business. After a bit of time and another contraction, much harder and longer this time, the bed was made. They were shown into the small, very basic bathroom off to the side, and Luke walked away whistling while Mary lay down and closed her eyes, feeling more and more like her pains truly were labor. Joseph, at this point, was so relieved to have some place to stay and resigned to the imperfections of their circumstances that he just sank down next to her and started rubbing her back, absent-mindedly. Almost as soon as Luke's whistling was out of earshot, Mary's water broke. An hour later, as the innkeeper and his wife were there, sitting down to a simple dinner of soup and fresh bread, the wife, Lydia, thought to ask about the young pregnant couple who had come in and whether they were guests or if they'd just come through to get bread, as some people did. "Oh, no, they didn't have a reservation," Luke said. "They're not in the house, but they gave me the most brilliant idea. They're out in the barn." His pride at his idea and his laughter suddenly died on his lips as he saw the stricken look on his wife's face. "What?" she said, blinking in confusion. "Luke, are you telling me that you sent a pregnant woman out to sleep in the barn?" "Why not? She said it was perfect." "A pregnant couple sleeping in bunk beds in a barn. Well, what's wrong with that? They loved it. They loved my mangers, too." "What is wrong with it? I'll tell you what is wrong with it. It's dirty. It's smelly. You know how my smell was so much stronger when I was pregnant. The horses can be loud, and it's a bunk bed. That can't be comfortable when you're 9 months pregnant. There's not even a shower. Did you get them clean sheets?" "Of course I did. I'm not a savage." And she wasn't that far along. I mean, you were lots bigger in your last pregnancy, and you could barely even waddle around. She was walking just fine. "I had twins in my last pregnancy, and thank you so much for reminding me of my waddle." "Well, you don't have a problem when I sleep out in the barn with the mares and the foals. What's the big deal?" Well, since you like to sleep out there so much, you can sleep out there tonight. And I'll sleep on the couch in our private sitting room, and they can have our bed, because there is no way I am letting a pregnant woman sleep in the barn. What kind of hospitality would that be? And she stormed off out of the table, while Luke sat down dumbfounded, trying to figure out what was the problem. A very brief time later, Lydia was back in a frenzied swirl of activity, gathering clean towels and extra sheets, rubbing alcohol, first aid kit, yelling at Luke to boil water and bring it to the barn. Why? She's having the baby now! Lydia had 5 children of her own, so she was no stranger to the birthing process, and Joseph gladly let a more experienced hand take over. And so it was, while they were there, the days were completed for Mary to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in the scarf from Joseph's relative and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now there were in the same area homeless people living off the side of the road. There were gas stations attendants keeping watch over their pumps by night, and even some shepherds in the fields attending to their sheep. And behold, around midnight, an angel of the Lord appeared in the sky, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were greatly afraid. And the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be for all people. For there is born to you this day in the Bethlehem Inn a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in a woolen scarf and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards all." And so it was, when the angels had gone away, the gas station attendants said to the homeless people, "Wow, let us go and see this thing in the Bethlehem Inn, which has been told to us, for the Lord has made it known." And they came with haste, and they met the shepherds along the way, intent on the same purpose. And Mary and Joseph were filled with joy and wonder at the beautiful, perfect baby boy, Jesus. And once the delivery was complete and the area was cleaned up, Lydia left them to rest and to share the news with Luke of the miracle that had occurred that night. For she believed their story and knew in her heart that God had indeed brought heaven to earth and allowed her to participate in some small way. At their insistence that they were perfectly happy out in the barn, she finally forgave her husband Luke for his strange ideas, while inwardly admitting to himself that maybe he'd been right to have Mary and Joseph stay, and that God sure did work in mysterious ways. The horses were calm. In fact, everything seemed to be peaceful. Mary asked Joseph to open the door to the outside for a bit of fresh air, and soon they heard, through the still night air, singing of many voices, praising God and coming steadily nearer. The people from the homeless camp, the gas station attendants, and the shepherds all came and arrived and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in the manger. And when they had seen him, they worshiped all the more and marveled at what had been told to them. And they shared the news across the town, and many people were in wonder and awe when they heard the story of what had occurred. But Mary kept all these things in her heart and pondered them in her heart. And the people returned to their own places, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had seen and heard, as it was told to them. The question that we all face at this time, in this unexpected season, with all these unknowns, how do we live in joy? I think we live in joy the same way that Mary and Joseph did, by trusting in God, by seeing opportunities where others just see limitations, by being thankful for what is rather than focusing on what ought to be or what has been in the past. And by sharing in the kindness of strangers, whether we get to give it or receive it, and remembering the truth that God has not forgotten us, and he's been working on our behalf all along. I bring to you good tidings of great joy. A child is born to us, Jesus, David's son, who will save us all, and who is with us, Emmanuel. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his kingdom and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. I'm going to pray over you, and then Richard will come up and close the service again. Dear God, I thank you for the power of your story, that no matter where or when it had happened, the miracle would be the same, and the truth would be the same, that you came to be with us. And whatever unexpected things we face or setbacks, you are here, and you will work on our behalf when we trust you and follow you. And I pray that that truth would settle deep in our hearts, that we would not worry, that we would not fear, that we would know that even if we're simple people living on the fringes of society, even if we don't get along with our families, even if we're facing loss of job or other things, you invite us into your story and you welcome us in. And we thank you for that. We thank you for your joy, which is always available when we'll reach out and grab it from you and turn towards you. And there's signs of your promise everywhere. Thank you, Lord, that you are with us. We don't have to ask you to be with us. We just thank you that you are, for you are. May we truly enjoy you this Christmas. In Jesus' name, amen.